NATO has rejected requests for an armed peace mission in Ukraine. Earlier on Tuesday, NATO member Poland had suggested that Western alliance must provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Instead, NATO is now looking to bolster its eastern flank following the Russian invasion. This is what the NATO chief had to say after a meeting of NATO defense ministers.
Of course, we support peace efforts. We call on Russia and President Putin to withdraw its forces, but we have no plans of deploying NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine.
Now, for more on this, WION correspondent Rosie Bercher is joining us live from Brussels. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, NATO has made it very clear time and again that it will not risk confrontation with Russia, and it is instead focused on bolstering its eastern flank. How do you see NATO's rejection?
Well, NATO ministers met in Brussels yesterday, and ministers from all 30 members of the alliance were present at the headquarters here in Brussels, and they were joined exceptionally by their Ukrainian counterpart who joined those talks virtually. So Ukraine would likely have been, though those talks were behind closed doors, reiterating that call for NATO assistance in the form of a no-fly zone. But just like NATO saying it will not send any troops into Ukraine, it has also rejected that call for a no-fly zone because NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg says it would essentially involve shooting Russian planes down from the sky, and he says the risk then of escalating this conflict into a greater war, a fully fledged war, he says, between Russia and NATO allies is simply too high, and that's why he's rejected those calls on behalf of the NATO alliance and all 30 of its member countries.
Absolutely. Now also let's talk about Ukrainian President Zelensky's address to the German parliament, where he's renewing calls to join the European Union, says that sanctions are not enough to end the Russian invasion, and we've seen that on ground. What can you tell us about that? Well, Ukraine has in the last few days kind of stepped back on what were once seen as really ardent ambitions to join NATO, but it's certainly not given up on its push to join the European Union, that other major institution headquartered here in Brussels. And that's something President Zelensky really highlighted again in that address. Now, President Zelensky and Ukraine as a whole has garnered some political backing in the European Union for a sort of fast-track procedure to membership. Ukraine has submitted its membership application, and so far countries including Poland and Lithuania have been quite outspoken in their support for trying to make this application move forward quickly. But I have to tell you that in the past, at least, joining the European Union has been a slow process, one full of legal procedures and one which involves adhering to strict criteria and conditions for entry. The last country to join the EU was Croatia. That was back in 2013, 10 years after it first became a member of the organisation of the Union. And that's why some prime ministers and heads of state within the European Union are saying there simply is no flexibility within the treaties to speed up this accession procedure, despite Ukraine's pleas for a fast track into the folds of the European Union. Right. Now, as we know, that Moscow has warned that any deliveries of military aid are legitimate targets for its military to strike. Now, are there any measures in place to combat this?
Well, there are measures in place, but we are absolutely not being told what they are. This is a question that was put to many defence ministers as they arrived to talks at the NATO headquarters yesterday. This announcement from Russia that it would see arms deliveries as legitimate targets will of course be on their minds. However, those ministers and the NATO chief all said that arms deliveries will continue. They will not be drawn on how exactly they are continuing, how they're being delivered. Those details, they say, are top secret precisely because they don't want to give Moscow any indication on how they are delivering that military aid, including lethal weapons to Ukraine. EU ambassadors, meanwhile, here in Brussels today, are discussing increasing military aid to Ukraine with a further potential 500 million euros. The European Union, until just a couple of weeks ago, had never provided a third country with military aid in the form of lethal weapons. That's something it has made a U-turn on, and something they are now looking to increase in the coming days.
Right. All right, Rosie, thank you so much for joining us with all your updates on this.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.